The Valley homeworld was dying, and everyone pretending otherwise was doing a poor job of it. I noticed it the moment our shuttle broke through the cloud layer. The sky was the wrong color, not dramatically wrong, just slightly off, the way a person's face goes slightly off when they are holding something they do not plan to say out loud. A pale amber where there should have been violet. A haziness at the horizon that the briefing documents called atmospheric mineral dispersion, and that I called what it was, the planet exhaling its last. My name is Marin Cole. I am 34 years old. I have been a soldier, a negotiator, and for the last 6 years, the Terran Coalition's primary liaison to the Valley Accord. I was 7 years old when the Valley bled themselves half to nothing defending a planet they had never visited, on behalf of a species that had never asked them. I grew up in the shadow of that fact. Most humans my age did. You do not grow up in a debt that large and come out the other side without feeling the shape of it in everything you do. The shuttle settled onto the landing platform with a sound like a long breath held and finally released. I stepped out into air that tasted faintly of copper and old rain. Around me, the capital city of Vel Sareth spread in every direction, all curved bone-white towers and soft geometric light, beautiful the way things are beautiful when they are almost gone. The streets below were not empty, but they were quieter than my last visit. I did not need a population report to understand what that quiet meant. High Consul Ethan met me at the platform's edge. He was tall, as all Valley were tall, with that particular stillness that their kind carried the way humans carry a heartbeat. He wore the formal silver gray of state ceremony. He extended his hand in the human fashion they had learned 20 years ago during the war, and I shook it. 3 fingers. I had read the numbers. The Valley regenerative biology was extraordinary. What the Keth had done to it was more extraordinary in the worst possible sense. Valley, who had fought on the front lines, had spent so much biological energy regenerating damage during combat that certain peripheral systems had simply stopped coming back. Fingers, ear structures. In the worst cases, the secondary respiratory membrane. The consul's right hand had 4 fingers in every photograph from before the war. I shook the 3 that remained and said nothing. The ceremony was formal and kind and entirely beside the point. The consul spoke in that low subsonic range that Valley used for public address, a frequency that did not hurt exactly but settled in your back teeth and stayed there. The translation piece in my ear kept pace. Gratitude, alliance, shared horizons. The old language of 2 peoples who had signed a document together and were now, diplomatically, honoring the ink. I stood straight and listened and watched the city. I had been given numbers before I boarded the shuttle. Valley population at the time of the Keth War, 900 million. Valley population today, 412 million. Not because of disease or famine, because of what it had cost them to stand in front of us. Their regenerative biology was a gift of evolution that had made them extraordinary warriors. It had also meant that every wound healed, yes, but every healing pulled from a reserve that, once emptied, did not come back. They had spent themselves, generously, completely, for us. I had held that number for 6 years, and it still landed on me every time like something dropped from a great height. After the ceremony, after the formal dinner where I ate Valley food I did not fully understand and smiled at things I found only half funny in translation, Consul Ethan asked me to walk with him to the high terrace. We stood above the city. The amber sky was deepening toward evening. Below, the soft geometric lights of Vel Sareth were coming on one by one, like something remembering how to hope. He said without preamble, without softening, "They are coming back." I turned to look at him. "The Keth," he said, "not a raid, not a border test. We have been watching the deep array signals for 14 months. They are assembling something we have no historical record of. Our analysts are calling it a reckoning fleet. The name is theirs. We intercepted the designation from a signal burst near the Thresh boundary." I said, "How long?" 6 months, perhaps 7. The city below did not know. The people moving through those quiet streets, the ones filling those emptier spaces where 488 million used to live. They were going about the business of an evening without any idea that the thing that had already taken half of them was reorganizing in the dark. I said, "What are your defense projections?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. A Valley moment of quiet is a particular thing. It is not hesitation. It is the processing of something that is already known and does not become easier for the knowing. He said, "We have modeled 47 scenarios. In 43 of them, we do not survive the first contact wave. In the remaining 4, we survive it but do not survive what comes after." I stood with that. "The Valley fought for us," I said, "without being asked." "Yes. And now you're asking." He looked at me. His eyes were the color of deep water, that particular pale blue-green that Valley eyes turned in old age when the secondary pigmentation faded. He said, very carefully, "We are informing you. What the Terran Coalition chooses to do with that information is a matter for your people to decide." It was a graceful sentence. It was also one of the most painful things anyone had ever said to me, because underneath its grace was the absolute acceptance that we might decide to do nothing, that they had considered this possibility, that they had made peace with it. I looked out over Velserith. I thought about my mother's headstone. I thought about the single journal entry she left behind, which I had memorized at age 12 and had not needed to read since because it lived in me the way a bone lives in you. She had been 22 during the war. She had watched the Valley ships come between the Keth and Earth. She had watched them spend themselves in our atmosphere's defense, and she had written 7 sentences about it that ended with, "They died so we could be stupid a little longer. Do not waste it." I turned back to the console. "Send me everything," I said. "Fleet data, Keth formation analysis, trajectory modeling, all of it. Every file you have." He said, "You understand what you are asking for." "I understand exactly what I'm asking for." He looked at me for a long time in that particular Valley way, where the stillness becomes a kind of weight. Then he said, "You were 7 years old when we came." "Yes. You grew up in it." "We all did." He nodded once slowly, and something in his expression shifted into something I did not have a word for. The translator in my ear offered nothing. Some things do not translate. I suspected that was the point. I left Velserith the following morning. The shuttle climbed up through that amber sky, and I watched the city shrink below me until it was just a pale cluster of light in a vast green-brown landscape. And then the clouds took it, and then there was only space. 6 months. I opened the data files Ethan had sent. The Keth Reckoning Fleet was not a fleet in any conventional sense. It was a statement. It was the kind of military construction that does not happen unless someone has decided, at the highest level of decision-making, that a thing needs to stop existing entirely. They had done this to 4 other species before us. There were no 4 other species before us anymore. I closed the files, opened them again, closed them. I looked out the shuttle window at the stars. Somewhere out there, in the deep dark between here and the Thresh boundary, something vast and patient and completely certain of itself was moving toward everything I had ever known. And the people who had saved us once had nothing left to give. I thought 6 months is not very long. I thought it is long enough. I pulled up a communication channel to Terran Coalition Command and began composing the most important message I had ever written, and the first word I typed was not a greeting. It was not a protocol header. It was not my name or rank or clearance code. It was, "Listen." The war room on level 7 of the Coalition Spire smelled like recycled air, old coffee, and the specific kind of fear that comes from powerful people confronting a problem that power alone cannot solve. I had been in this room before, twice for treaty negotiations, once for a border incident that nearly became something worse. Each time, it had the same quality. That particular heaviness of a space where important things had been decided by people who were very good at projecting certainty, they did not always feel. Today there were 14 of them around the table. Generals, admirals, 2 civilian strategic advisors, a xenobiologist who had spent 30 years studying the Keth and had the tired eyes to show for it. They had read my preliminary report on the shuttle home. I could tell because they had arranged their faces into the specific expression people arrange when they have read something alarming and have decided to be calm about it in a way that is not quite convincing. I stood at the end of the table and presented the Vayli data without softening it. The Keth Reckoning Fleet was comprised of an estimated 600 warships, a number that drew a silence from the room that had actual texture to it. The fleet's tactical formation, based on the deep array intercepts Ethan had provided, was built around something the Vayli analysts called a convergence doctrine. Every ship in the formation served a function in a larger geometric pattern. It was not simply ships firing at targets. It was a precision instrument of a size that strained comprehension, designed to eliminate not just a defense, but the capacity for any future defense. They had used this formation at a world called Serath 4. Nothing at Serath 4 had survived to name what happened to it. General Owen Briggs, head of the Terran Coalition Ground Command, was the first to speak when I finished. He was a large man who had come up through combined arms infantry and wore his medals the way people wear things they have genuinely earned, without thinking about it. He said, "Our current deep space deployment capability sits at approximately 140 warships, against 600 with a doctrine we've never encountered and a fleet that took out the Vayli at the height of their strength." He did not say the rest. He did not need to. Fleet Admiral Nina Voss said it instead, not cruelly, just plainly. "We are not the Vayli. Their biology, their tactical cognition, their hive coordination systems, we do not have any of that." I said, "No, we don't." She waited. I said, "We have something they don't." The room went quiet in a different way than before. Before, it had been the quiet of people absorbing bad news. This was the quiet of people deciding whether or not to be curious. Admiral Voss said, "Which is?" I did not answer immediately. I let the question sit in the air for exactly long enough. Then I said, "I'll get to that. But first I need you to understand what I'm proposing, because if you reject it on the numbers alone, we will have this exact conversation again in 5 months when there is no longer time for any conversation at all." I pulled up the Vayli trajectory models on the room's display. The Keth fleet path was a clean arc through deep space, curving toward Vayli home territory like a drawn blade. The timeline sat in the upper corner of the display in clear red numerals. 6 months, 2 weeks, estimated first contact with Vayli defensive perimeter, which, as the data showed, was a perimeter in name only at this point. I said, "I am not proposing we defend Vayli space from inside Vayli space. I am proposing we take the fight out to meet them before they reach it." Brigadier General Kate Holloway, who ran Coalition Special Operations, and who I had always respected for the particular quality of her silence when she was thinking, said, "A deep strike operation." "A deep strike operation," I confirmed. "Hit their forward staging before they reach full assembly range. Disrupt the convergence doctrine before it can be deployed. Force them to respond to us instead of moving on their own timeline." Owen Briggs said slowly, "With 140 ships." "With what we can build," I said, "in 6 months." The room moved then, the way rooms move when people are wrestling with something large. Chairs shifted. Papers were shuffled. 2 of the generals exchanged a look that was not quite skepticism and not quite fear and was both things at once. Dr. Philip Crane, the xenobiologist who had been quiet until now, said, "The Keth have never fought humans directly, in any extended engagement. The war 20 years ago was entirely prosecuted by the Vayli. The Keth tactical database, based on everything we've been able to gather, contains almost no reliable data on human military behavior. He paused, looked at me. That is what you were about to say, isn't it? I nodded. They don't know what we do, I said. They don't know how we fight. They have models built on what the Veli did, on what the Serath did before them, on every species that has ever engaged them in structured military conflict. Those models are very good. They work. They have worked against every species that has ever engaged them. I looked around the table. But those models have one thing in common. Every species in them fought the way a species fights when it has had time to develop a doctrine, a system, a structure. The Veli fought with geometric precision and coordinated regenerative infantry. The Serath used mass drone formations. The Keth knows how to defeat those approaches because it has faced versions of them before. I pulled up the display on the shipyard projections. Earth's orbital construction platforms. The emergency manufacturing protocols that had been sitting in a coalition contingency file for 11 years, waiting. We have never fought the Keth, I said. They have never seen us. Not really. Not in a way that counted. And the thing about humans, the thing that keeps showing up in every conflict assessment our own analysts have done, is that we do not fight the way the models say we should. Nina Voss said quietly, because we don't fight like we're supposed to. Because we don't fight like we're supposed to, I agreed. Another silence, a longer one. Then Kate Holloway said, what do we need? And we began. The next 6 months were not clean. They were not cinematic. They did not look the way mobilization looks in the stories people tell afterward, all purpose and clarity and marching in the same direction. They looked like a shipyard in Karachi running 3 shifts with the kind of tired that settles in behind your eyes and stays. They looked like a procurement officer in Oslo arguing with a supply chain that had never been designed for this scale, arguing in the specific desperate way of someone who knows the deadline is not negotiable. They looked like a 17-year-old in Manitoba who added 4 years to her age on the enlistment form, and whose hands shook while she did it, and who signed it anyway. I watched it from inside the machine of it, moving between coalition member states and orbital construction platforms and military briefings, and the thing I kept noticing, the thing that kept catching in me, was that nobody waited to be told. There was a moment in the 3rd month I was passing through the secondary assembly platform above the Pacific, and I stopped at a viewport that looked out over the growing fleet. Ships in various stages of completion. Some still frameworks. Some already running system tests, their engine cores burning soft blue in the dark. A construction crew was doing a zero-gravity hull seal operation on the nearest ship. 4 figures in work suits moving in the practiced choreography of people who had done this 10,000 times. One of them waved at the viewport as they passed. I raised my hand and waved back. I do not know why that moment stayed with me more than any of the strategic briefings, or the resource allocation meetings, or the late-night arguments over tactical doctrine. Something about the wave, the fact that it was offered. I went to my mother's grave in the 5th month. I had not been since the 2nd year after she died. I stood there for a while without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that she had not already written down in that journal entry I carried in place of a memory of her voice. They died so we could be stupid a little longer. Do not waste it. I was trying not to waste it. I stood there until the wind picked up, and then I drove back to the base and finished preparing for launch. The fleet that departed Earth's orbital staging point at the end of the 6th month was not 600 ships. It was 216. Not everything that had been started was finished. Not everything that was finished worked the way it was supposed to. 2 of the cruisers in the 3rd wave had engine synchronization issues that the crew chief told me were resolved, and that I suspected were managed rather than resolved. 216 ships. Against 600. The numbers were what they were. I had stopped looking at the numbers as a fixed sentence and started looking at them as a variable. The Keth believed in their numbers the way they believed in their models. Their certainty was the thing. Their certainty was the door. We intended to walk through it. The GSV reparation was my ship. I had named it in my head the first time I saw it on the construction manifest. The coalition had called it Hull Designation 7 Alpha 9. I had put in a formal request for the name change and pushed it up 3 levels of bureaucracy until someone approved it out of sheer exhaustion with my persistence. Reparation, not revenge, not triumph. The word I kept coming back to, the one that lived in that debt that had been in my bones since I was 7 years old. We left Earth on a Tuesday. The sky above the launching platform was clear and blue and entirely ordinary, the kind of sky that looks like it has no idea what is happening, and I was grateful for that, for the ordinariness of it, because ordinariness is the thing you are fighting to get back. I did not look back at it. I had learned, a long time ago, that looking back at something you are not sure you will see again does not help. You carry it forward instead. You put it in your chest where it will stay and not ask anything of you until the moment when it needs to. We went out into the dark. The Keth were out there, patient and certain, and entirely confident in their models. We were about to give them something their models had no entry for. The Thresh Nebula was not beautiful up close. From the long-range visual feeds, it looked the way nebulas always look in images, all slow color and quiet grandeur. Up close, inside it, it was a wall of interference. Our sensors cut to 30% effective range. Navigation ran on dead reckoning, and the kind of intuition that experienced pilots develop from years of flying in conditions that should have finished them. The light moved strangely through the gas clouds, bending at angles that made distances unreliable. The Keth Advance column was in there somewhere. We knew their projected vector. We knew their formation depth from the Bailey intercept data. What we did not know was whether they had updated their route since the last intercept, 14 days ago, or whether something in our own approach had tripped an early detection system we hadn't identified. I was on the bridge of the reparation when the long-range array picked them up. Lieutenant Commander Dan Cole, my tactical officer and no relation despite the shared name, looked up from his console and said simply, "Contact." The display updated. The Keth column was 47 ships, a forward element, not the full reckoning fleet, but a scouting and control formation designed to clear the approach corridor and establish communication relays for the main fleet behind it. 47 ships, moving in that perfect geometric formation that Bailey tactical analysts had flagged in the briefing data, every vessel positioned in exact mathematical relationship to every other, a moving shape that functioned as a single instrument. Our fleet was 61 ships. The rest of the 216 were split across 2 other approach vectors, part of a 3-pronged interdiction plan that Kate Holloway had built around the assumption that the Keth would not expect anyone to come at them from inside the nebula. Nobody came into the Thresh Nebula by choice. The interference alone made it a navigation hazard. The debris field in the nebula's inner band had destroyed 2 unmanned survey probes in the last decade. We had come through it anyway. On the reparation's secondary bridge, where I had assigned our Bailey observer, Sareth stood watching the tactical display with an expression I had come to read over 6 months of working alongside him. Sareth was a Bailey military analyst, not a fighter, assigned by Consul Ethan to observe and document. He was older than most Bailey I had met, with that deep-water eye color that age brought, and he spoke rarely and precisely, and always said the specific thing rather than the approximate one. He had been watching us for 6 months. He had watched us train, argue, rebuild broken systems at 2 in the morning, eat strange food during briefings, laugh at things that were not funny as a way of moving through things that were. He had not said much about any of it. Their formation is establishing phase geometry, Dan said from his console. They're running the convergence prep sequence, standard pre-engagement. How long until they're in full convergence lock? I said. 8 minutes, maybe 9. I said, we don't let them reach it. I turned to the fleet-wide channel. Every captain in all 61 ships would be receiving this. I had thought about what to say. I had thought about it for the full transit through the nebula, and I had arrived at the same answer every time, which was that grand speeches are for people who are not in a hurry. I said, they're not in convergence yet. Hit them before they get there. Execute your plans, trust your crews, that's all. I closed the channel. The Terran fleet moved. What it looked like from the outside, from any reasonable tactical analysis standpoint, was wrong. The Keth were trained to read attack formations, wedge formations, flanking arcs, layered advance patterns. Every species that had ever engaged them had come in some recognizable geometric shape, because that is what a coordinated military force does. You organize. You create a coherent pattern that allows for command and response. We had something that looked, at first pass, like 61 ships all making individual decisions. That was not wrong. It was the plan, sort of. What Kate Holloway's doctrine had understood, and what I had understood from watching humans train for 6 months, was that human coordination was not the same thing as Vayli coordination. The Vayli had a form of distributed tactical cognition that was partly biological, a high resonance in their nervous systems that allowed for instantaneous fleet-level decisions without communication lag. We could not replicate that. We had not tried to replicate it. What we had instead was something harder to model. Human crews talked. They adjusted. A gunner who noticed something unexpected on her console told her captain, who told the fleet net. And in the space of 40 seconds, a tactical adjustment that no central command had ordered had propagated through 30 ships, because every crew was listening to every other crew and making calls on their own authority within a framework loose enough to allow for it. It looked like chaos because it was not centralized. It was not chaos. The Keth formation registered the Terran approach and began the counter-adjustment sequence. Their models would have told them, incoming attack vector, classify formation type, deploy countermeasure pattern. They had 42 countermeasure patterns, one for every formation type in their database. Our formation did not match any of them. I watched the Keth response on the tactical display. There was a pause, not long, 2-3 seconds, but it was there. That was not something their models had ever produced before. Dan said from his console, their convergence sequence has stalled. They're running a classification query. I said, how long does that buy us? Unknown, no precedent for it. It bought us 90 seconds. 90 seconds where the perfect geometric instrument of the Keth advance column was trying to identify what it was looking at instead of shooting at it. In those 90 seconds, our forward group hit the column's left flank at 3 different points simultaneously, not because they had been ordered to hit the same flank at the same time, but because 3 different captains independently assessed the same vulnerability and moved on it. The Keth column fractured. Not badly, not decisively, but the geometric precision cracked at 2 joints, 2 ships moving out of their assigned positions to cover gaps, the formation no longer perfect. An imperfect Keth formation was still an extremely dangerous Keth formation. The engagement became complicated very quickly. I will not pretend it was controlled. It was not controlled. It was 61 ships and 47 ships in a nebula that ate 30% of every sensor reading, and people were making decisions on partial information at speeds that left no room for consultation. The fleet communication net was a continuous stream of updates and warnings and corrections, and occasionally, one crew member yelling at another crew member in a way that was not in the tactical doctrine, but that seemed to work. On the reparation, we took damage to the port engine array in the first 8 minutes. The damage control team rerouted to secondary systems before I had finished asking for a status report. The ship's AI flagged a targeting solution on the nearest Keth heavy vessel, and I watched my senior gunner, Petra Walsh, override it within 3 seconds. I said, Walsh. She said without looking up, the AI is running the solution against standard shield geometry. Their shields are running modified geometry on the port side. I can see it in the emission variants. Give me 40 seconds. I gave her 40 seconds. She fired. The Keth heavy vessel registered significant damage and pulled back from its position, creating a gap that the Meridian, one of our mid-range vessels, moved into without being asked, because its captain could see the same gap and knew what to do with it. Sarath came forward from the secondary bridge. He stood beside me and watched the display and said nothing for a long time. The engagement ran for 2 hours and 17 minutes. At the end of it, the Keth column had been reduced from 47 ships to 31. We had lost 9 ships and everyone on them, names I would read in the morning and carry after that. The column was pulling back, reforming, not retreating but contracting into a defensive posture that its doctrine would use to reestablish formation integrity before continuing. We had not destroyed it. The mission had not been to destroy it. The mission had been to cost them time, to crack the certainty of their approach, to put something in their path that their models had no clean answer for. I looked at the tactical readout. The column's reformation was slower than their doctrine predicted. The command traffic we were intercepting from them was heavier than it should have been, more signals between ships, more queries, the specific pattern of a system running calculations it had not been designed to run. Dan said quietly, "They're flagging the engagement to the main fleet." I said, "What's the classification they're sending?" He read for a moment, said, "The translation is approximate. The closest equivalent is anomalous contact requiring reassessment." Sarath spoke then. He had been standing beside me for 90 minutes and these were his first words. He said, "In 14 years of monitoring Keth communications, our analysts have never seen that classification." I looked at him. He was looking at the display. His expression was the one I had been trying to read for 6 months, the one that was not quite what I had any human word for. He said, "They have a designation for every type of enemy they have encountered, every species, every tactical style, every formation, 46 designations." He paused. "They have assigned you a new one." I turned back to the display. The Keth column was still reforming, still recalculating, still looking at us with that slight pause that their models had never produced before. I thought about 9 ships, 9 crews. I thought about 31 ships that were still out there and still coming. I thought about 600 ships behind them and a Valley homeworld with 412 million people and an amber sky that was slightly the wrong color. I went to the medbay that evening. I walked the rows. I stopped at one bed near the far end, occupied by a young crew member from the Aldgate who had been pulled from debris, one of only 4 survivors from that ship. She was unconscious, 22 years old, from a city I had visited once for a trade conference. I stood there for a while. I did not move for a long time. There are things that happen in the space between what you plan to do and what the situation asks of you. And the only honest thing to say about them is that you stand there and you hold them and you do not look away from them. And then you go back to the bridge and you keep doing what you came out here to do. I went back to the bridge. The Keth main fleet, 600 ships, received the anomalous contact report from the advance column. Their supreme directive issued a response. Our signals team intercepted it. The translation came through 14 minutes later, 17 words in the Keth operational language rendered into the closest English equivalents. 17 words. The last 3 were the ones Dan brought to me without comment, just set the translation on the display in front of me and waited. The last 3 words were, "Recalculate the human variable." I read them twice. Then I said, "Good." The mission briefing for the deep strike into Keth-held space had 3 classification levels and a casualty projection on page 9 that I had read once, carefully, and not read again. I understood the number. I had placed it where numbers like that go when you cannot afford to let them stop you, in a part of your mind that is not the part running the mission. The number would come back later. Numbers like that always did. But later was not now, and now was what we had. The approach corridor ran through the outer edge of the Thresh system, past a debris field that our navigation team had spent 3 weeks mapping, and into deep Keth-controlled space, along a vector that Veli intelligence had identified as a gap in the Keth standard monitoring array. The gap existed because the Keth had never needed to watch that particular corridor. Nothing had ever come at them through it. We had 43 ships for this leg. The reparation led. Alongside us were vessels whose names I had memorized the way I memorized things that mattered. The Aldersham, the Peel, the Colony, the Bray. Smaller ships, faster, built in those last frantic months on the orbital platforms by people who had worked through conditions that made the word difficult feel inadequate. Sarath was still with us. He had transmitted his preliminary report to Vel Sarath after the Thresh engagement and had requested to remain with the fleet. Consul Ethon had approved it. I had the impression, reading the phrasing of the approval, that the consul had been surprised by the request but had not wanted to deny it. On the third day of transit, Sarath found me in the navigation room during the night cycle, when it was empty except for the 2 duty officers running the autopilot watch. I was looking at the star charts, not analytically, just looking at them, the way you look at something vast when the inside of your head needs somewhere larger to put what it contains. He said, "May I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." "There is a word in Veli," he said. "I have been trying to find its equivalent in your language for 6 months. I do not think one exists." He said the word. It was a subsonic construction, partly felt rather than heard, 3 syllables that settled somewhere between my sternum and my throat. "It means," he said slowly, working through the translation with the visible effort of someone being precise with something that resists precision, "the particular grief of living past the person who first believed you were capable of something significant, the person whose belief existed before you had given them evidence for it." I said nothing. He said, "There is no short version. There is no single word in any of the 6 other languages I have studied. I thought you might find that interesting." I said, "I find it very accurate." He looked at me. "You know the feeling. I've known the shape of it since I was 7 years old." I did not elaborate. He did not ask. We stood for a while looking at the star charts together and not saying anything, and it was one of those silences that is full rather than empty, the kind where 2 people are not talking because they are already understanding each other. I wrote the word down in my own handwriting before I left the navigation room, phonetically, so I could keep it, so it would not leave me the same way she had. The Keth forward staging nexus was located in a system with no human designation, because humans had never been here before. Veli star maps called it by a number. I had been calling it the target for long enough that I had started to forget it had coordinates. We reached the system's edge on day 11. The nexus was massive, not a space station in any human engineering sense. The Keth built in a different tradition, their structures growing along functional lines without concern for human ideas about form. It was a collection of interconnected modules spread across 200 kilometers, all angled surfaces and communication arrays, and the deep energy signature of a transit coordination hub feeding logistics data to the reckoning fleet moving toward Veli space behind us. Destroying this would not stop the fleet. The fleet was already assembled and moving. What it would do was sever the real-time coordination network that tied the fleet's convergence doctrine together. 600 ships operating as a single geometric instrument required continuous communication with a central coordination point. Remove that point, and the fleet would have to fall back on individual ship-level decision-making, which was slower, and which would fracture the precise timing on which the convergence doctrine depended. It would not win the war. It would buy Veli space-time, and it would buy Earth's main fleet time, and time was what we had come all this way to spend. The Nexus had an escort of 38 ships. We had 43. The approach plan had 3 phases. Phase 1 was a long-range strike from the system's edge, designed to degrade the Nexus's defensive array before we came in close. Phase 2 was a close approach by our 6 heaviest ships to deliver sustained fire on the Nexus's core coordination modules. Phase 3 was withdrawal on the outbound vector, which, as the navigational analysis showed clearly, was significantly complicated by the fact that our entry vector was now going to be monitored. The mission briefing had addressed this with a phrase that military planners use when the honest version of a thing is too specific: vector reassessment upon completion. The crew chiefs on most of our ships had a less formal version of the same phrase. I had heard it 3 times in 3 different forms in the week before departure. The meaning was the same in all of them. We were not leaving the way we came in. I had known this when I planned it. The crew chiefs had known it when they'd said what they'd said. The captains had known it. The crews had known it. Nobody had brought it up in terms that required a direct response, because the kind of people who sign up for a mission like this are the kind of people who have already had that conversation with themselves and arrived at their own answer before they ever walked up the gangway. Phase 1 began at 0400 ship time. The long-range strike went well, better than the models had projected, which I had learned to be careful about, because things going better than the models projected had a specific tendency to be followed by things going worse than the models projected, and you needed to save your confidence for where it was actually needed. Phase 2 was when the Nexus's secondary defense system came online. It had not been in the Valley intelligence data, not because the data was wrong, but because it was old, because the Keth had modified their Nexus defense architecture in the last 8 months after our signals team concluded the Thresh engagement. They had been watching what we did. They had made adjustments. They were good at making adjustments. The secondary defense system was a coordinated point defense array that made our close approach plan functionally impossible for our heaviest ships, which were too large and too slow to maneuver through the fire density. The tactical display showed this about 40 seconds after we entered close approach range. Dan showed me the readout. He did not say anything. The readout said everything. I said options. Chief Navigation Officer Glenn Park said, "We have 3 mid-range ships fast enough to get through the array gaps, but they can't carry the sustained fire load the plan calls for." I said, "Can they carry enough?" Glenn was quiet for a moment that was specifically the kind of quiet that is not hesitation but calculation. He said, "Maybe. If they run coordinated passes instead of sustained fire, hit, move, hit again, it'll take longer." Tactical specialist Nina Haig looked up from the secondary console. Nina was 26 years old and had come out of a university mathematics program and had the brain for simultaneous multivariable problems that some people have and cannot explain and cannot teach. She said, "If we can get them to run the passes in sequence such that the recharge lag on the defense array's sector 3 overlaps between each pass, the effective window is longer than it looks." I said, "How long to calculate that?" She said, "I'm already doing it." She was already doing it. She had started before I asked. The calculation ran on her personal console and the whiteboard she had pulled from its mount on the wall, because somewhere in the first hour of the engagement our ship's central AI had taken a hit that had put 3 of its 6 processing cores offline, and Nina had pulled the whiteboard out and started working by hand without a word about it. She worked for 9 minutes. The passing of those 9 minutes was one of the longer 9 minutes I have spent anywhere. She said, "Got it," and fed the result to the fleet net. The 3 mid-range ships, the Colony, the Bray, and a smaller vessel called the Pen that had been built in the last 6 weeks and had never been in combat before this mission, ran the coordinated pass sequence. It worked. It worked because Nina Haig had grown up doing math in a family that did not own a computer, and had developed the habit of working in her head first and only checking her work on a machine afterward. It worked because of a competency that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with the specific history of a specific person who had ended up on a specific ship at a specific moment where that history was exactly what was needed. The Nexus's coordination core took the sustained damage it needed to take. Module by module, the Valley analysts had specified which ones, in what order to achieve the required signal disruption. We hit them. The Nexus's communication array went dark. The cost was, the colony was gone by the end of the pass sequence. All hands, 41 people. The Bray had significant damage but was functional. The Pen had come through with minor hull stress and a crew that was, by their own report on the fleet net, shaking but present. I received the news about the colony in the same moment that the Nexus went dark. The two facts arrived together. I held both of them. I turned to the fleet net. I said, Nexus is down. Begin withdrawal on Vector 47. Navigation leads. Stay tight. Vector 47 was not the vector we had come in on. Vector 47 was the long way around, through a debris field on the system's far side, because the entry vector was, as expected, now being watched. It would take 22 days instead of 11. 22 days on reduced supplies, with damaged ships, through a navigation challenge that Glenn Park had described to me privately as technically interesting. Glenn Park's definition of technically interesting was a thing I had learned to prepare for carefully. But we were moving. The reparation turned on Vector 47, and the fleet formed up behind it, and we started the long way home. On the second night of the withdrawal, I went to my quarters and I sat on the edge of my bunk, and I took out the small notebook where I had written the Valley word. I looked at it for a while, phonetic letters in my own handwriting, holding something that had no translation. I thought about my mother. I thought about 41 names I would read in the morning. I thought, I do not know if this is what you meant. I thought, I think it is. I closed the notebook. I lay down on the bunk and I looked at the ceiling of the reparation in the dark, and somewhere behind us, in a system with no human name, a nexus that had been coordinating the end of everything I knew was cold and silent. We had not won. We had bought time. Time was what I had come all this way to spend. The Keth Reckoning fleet changed course 4 days after we left the target system. We received the intercept from Valley Deep Array monitoring on day 6 of the withdrawal transit. Dan brought it to me in the navigation room without a preamble, just set the display in front of me. I read the trajectory update. I read it again. The fleet was no longer heading toward Valley home space. It was heading toward the Sol system, toward Earth. I stood with that for a long time, longer than I should have, maybe. I was aware of Dan waiting, aware of Glenn looking up from the navigation console, aware of the sound of the ship around me, all its working sounds, the ones you stop hearing after a few weeks aboard and then suddenly hear very clearly when something has changed. The Keth had recalculated. Not because we had scared them. I was careful not to think that. You do not survive the kind of situation we were now in by telling yourself comfortable stories about what your enemy is feeling. They had recalculated because we had damaged their coordination network and disrupted their timeline. And a disrupted timeline for a fleet that large had strategic implications that made the Valley homeworld a lower priority target than the species responsible for the disruption. We had moved the weapon. We had moved it toward home. I spent 1 hour alone in my quarters and I let myself feel all of it, the weight of that, the full shape of that decision and what it had cost and what it was going to cost. 1 hour. Then I washed my face and went back to the bridge and did what came next. I sent a communication to Terran Coalition Command. Clear text. No code. The message was 4 sentences. The last one said, "We will be home in 16 days. Do not stop building." They had not stopped building. The response came back in 6 hours. Admiral Voss, 3 words, we see you. We transited home in 16 days and 4 hours. The debris field on the approach to Earth's defense perimeter had been partially cleared by automated systems that had been running continuously while we were gone. The orbital construction platforms were lit up in a way they had not been when we left. More ships, more completed, more running hot and ready. The fleet that had assembled in Earth orbit while we were in Keth space was 340 ships. 340 ships against 600. Not enough. The numbers were what the numbers were, but numbers were not the only variable, and I was no longer working from the same relationship to numbers that I had carried into this mission. The Reckoning Fleet entered detection range of the Sol system on the 40th day after the Nexus strike. They sent a hail. This was reported to me by the communications officer on the flagship Terran vessel, the Kelston, which was the designated command ship for this engagement, and from which Admiral Voss was directing the fleet. I was aboard the reparation in the 4th position of the formation, and I received the hail notification the same moment as the rest of the command staff. The Keth Supreme Commander of the Reckoning Fleet was communicating. This had, as Sareth confirmed for me with a precision that I had come to rely on in the same way you rely on a compass, never happened. Not once. Not in the 4 extinctions the Keth had previously delivered to other species. Not in the war 20 years ago. Not in any engagement in the Valley historical record going back 300 years. They had never sent a hail. Admiral Voss opened a response channel and asked me on a secondary line whether I wanted to take it. I said yes. The translation came through the earpiece. The Keth Supreme Commander spoke in operational language, flat and precise, with no emotional content our instruments could register. The translation was, "You are a single origin world. Your military capacity is below species-level defensive threshold. You have interfered with a sanctioned reckoning process. The outcome of this engagement is calculated. Surrender of your solar system will be processed within standard parameters." I said through the translator channel, "No." There was a pause, brief but there. The commander said, "Then explain your presence here." I did not think about what I was going to say. There was no prepared speech. There was just the truth, which was the only thing that had ever been available. I said, "Someone stood between us and you 20 years ago. People we had never met from a planet we had never visited who decided that what happened to us mattered. They paid for that decision with everything they had. We didn't ask them to. We couldn't have stopped them if we'd tried." I paused. "They're 412 million now," I said. "They used to be 900 million. You did that, and now you're here for us." Another pause. The commander said, "This is not an explanation for your presence." "I'm getting there," I said. "We are here because someone did this for us once, and we are the kind of people who pay what they owe. That's the explanation." I closed the channel. Admiral Voss on the command line said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "All right then, let's go." The battle for the Sol system lasted 11 hours. I will not tell it as a clean story because it was not clean. It was 340 ships against 600, inside our own solar system, with Earth behind us, and everything we had ever known behind that. And there was nothing about any of it that was simple or safe or easy to hold in a single thought. The Keth opened with their convergence doctrine, 600 ships moving into the precise geometric formation that had ended 4 civilizations, that perfect instrument of coordinated destruction that their database had spent 1,000 years refining. It was extraordinary to watch on the tactical display. Even knowing what it was, even with everything it meant, the mathematical precision of it had a quality that I had no clean feeling about. We did not meet it with a counterformation. Kate Holloway's final doctrine, the one she had built from 6 months of watching humans train and fail and argue and rebuild and train again, was the hardest thing to explain to anyone who had not watched us develop it. The Valley observer who had attended the final tactical briefing had asked, very carefully, whether this was a tested approach or a theoretical one. Kate had told him it was both and neither. He had, with genuine respect and what I suspected was significant unease, said he would file that as a new category. What it looked like from the outside was 340 ships moving in a pattern that was almost a formation. Almost. Close enough that the Keth convergence doctrine could not immediately classify it as non-formation. Far enough from a standard formation that their counter-protocols misfired twice in the first 20 minutes, deploying responses to movements we were not actually making. The classification delay, again, longer this time. 17 seconds. In 17 seconds, our forward group hit the convergence geometry at its 7 most structurally critical joints simultaneously, not through central command, but through a FleetNet call-and response that had developed over 6 months of practice into something that had no proper name, where a captain on the left flank flagged a vulnerability, and 6 other captains responded to the flag, and moved without waiting for confirmation because they had learned, all of them, to trust the person flagging more than they trusted the time it took to verify. The first joint of the convergence geometry broke. The second broke 11 minutes later. By the third hour, the Keth fleet was no longer running a convergence doctrine. It was running individual ship engagements, which was what they dropped to when the geometric instrument failed, and they were very good at it, and we took significant damage, and we lost ships, and the names of the people on those ships are the part of this that I carry in the way that the heaviest things are carried, not easily, not lightly, but forward. The specific moment. Hour 7. The Keth fleet had been reduced to 402 ships through the combination of our strikes and their own formation confusion, and our fleet was at 208, and the engagement had moved into the inner system, and we were fighting in the orbital range of Mars when a junior weapons officer on the Aldersham named Robbie Hale, who had been playing competitive strategy games since he was 9 years old and had joined the fleet because he could not imagine a reason not to, identified something in the Keth mid-formation that no one else had flagged. The Keth, under the pressure of the engagement, had developed a reflex. When their left flank ships came under fire, they drew resources from the right center to compensate. Not once, 4 times. The same response, triggered by the same stimulus, 4 times in 7 hours. Robbie Hale said this on the fleet net in the specific calm voice of someone who is too focused to perform anything. He said, "They do the same thing every time. If we hit the left flank hard enough, the right center empties. And if the right center empties, the rear command group has no cover." The fleet net went silent for about 3 seconds. Then 6 captains started moving. The maneuver that followed was not in any doctrine. It did not have a name at the time. It acquired one later, an embarrassing name, because Robbie Hale had a specific sense of humor, and the fleet net recording was public record. And the name he said aloud in the moment when the maneuver began was not professional, and was also exactly right, and it stuck through every war college curriculum that adopted it in the years following, and students learned it without knowing its origin. And every few years someone found the original recording and the story traveled again. The right center emptied. The rear command group was exposed for 48 seconds. In 48 seconds, 11 Terran ships hit the Keth rear command group with everything they had. The Keth Supreme Commander's vessel took critical damage and went dark. The Reckoning Fleet, without central command, without convergence coordination, without the real-time intelligence feed from the nexus we had silenced weeks ago, did something their 1,000-year tactical record showed they had never done. They stopped. Not retreat, not a fighting withdrawal, they stopped. The tactical display showed it in real time. Ship after ship halting its engagement, the precise geometric patterns dissolving, the fleet still there, still present, still 600 vessels minus what we had taken from them. But still. I said on the fleet net, "Hold fire." The order traveled in about 4 seconds. 11 hours of noise and damage and loss and decision, making at a speed that leaves marks, and then silence. The Keth fleet sat in the silence. They sat there for 40 minutes. Then they turned, not toward Earth, not toward Valley space, away, on a vector that our navigators plotted immediately and that ran out to deep space, to the outer dark, to nothing we had a name for. Admiral Voss said on the command line very quietly, "They're leaving." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then someone on the fleet net, I never found out who, said, "Yeah," in the specific tone of someone who is sitting down because their legs have decided they are done. Sarath was on the bridge of the reparation. He had been there for the last 4 hours, standing beside the secondary console, not speaking, watching. I looked at him. He was looking at the display, at the retreating shape of the Keth reckoning fleet moving away from everything it had come to destroy. His expression was something I did not have a word for. He had told me there was a Valley word for it. I had written it in my notebook in phonetic letters. I thought about it now, and thought that it was probably not exactly right for this moment, but was close enough that the distance between it and the right word was the kind of distance that might not have a name in any language. He said, "They have retreated from 4 other species." I said, "I know." "They did not retreat," he said. "They ended." I said, "I know." He looked at me. "We did not expect this." I said, "No." "You did," he said. "It was not a question." I said honestly, "I hoped." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in Valley, the word he had taught me in the navigation room on the way to the target. The word for the grief of living past the person who believed in you first. He said it once precisely, and then he said, "I think perhaps there is another meaning. I think it has a second meaning I was not taught." I said, "What is it?" He said, "The relief of becoming the evidence, of becoming the thing that justifies what someone believed before they had reason to." I looked out at the stars. Earth was behind us, whole present. 412 million Valley were somewhere in the direction of that amber sky, on a homeworld that was still standing. I thought about my mother's grave and the wind that had come up when I stood there, and the 7 sentences she had left me, and the last one. "Do not waste it." I was still working on that. I intended to keep working on it. A message came in from Vel Sarath, from the consul's office. It was not formatted in the standard diplomatic register. It was not in official Valley. It had clearly been written by the consul himself, in the broken English he had been teaching himself, according to Sarath, for the past year. 7 words. "We see you now, we see you." I read it twice. I did not respond right away. I stood at the viewport of the reparation, with Earth behind me and the retreating dark ahead of me, and a message in 7 words that carried the weight of 20 years and 900 million lives, and one child standing at a window not understanding, yet what it means to live in someone else's sacrifice. I understand it now. Not completely. You do not understand something like that completely. You carry it. You carry it and you try to be worth the carrying, and on the best days you get a little closer to it, and on the other days you just keep going. I thought we didn't do it to be seen. But it helped. It helped more than I have words for. And there are a lot of things in this story that I do not have words for, and I am beginning to think that the distance between what we can say and what we mean is not a failure of language. It is just the shape of the things that matter most. I wrote the consul back. 3 words my own. "We see you."